Welcome, John. From London here, I'm David Doherty at the mHealth mHealth Insight today, and we're discussing coronavirus. John, could you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Sure. I've been an investigative reporter freelance for 38 years now, written for publications in the US and Europe on many issues, political, cultural, but also with a heavy emphasis on medical. And so I've covered a number of past epidemics, shall we call them, and have come to my own conclusions, and we'll be talking about some of that today.
Okay. Look, the reason why this has happened is we've had the world's biggest mobile event has been cancelled because of coronavirus, and the idea is that bringing 110,000 people together would be, with the understanding that we currently have about how infectious this disease is, and with the predominance of Chinese companies in this area and equipment manufacturing for telcos. So this is a problem. People want to try and understand the different perspectives and the opportunities for mobile. We're seeing some new laws being passed quite urgently in places like Taiwan. They're looking at a new law which would bring in perhaps $100,000 fine, up to $100,000 fine, and up to 3 years jail for discussing or sharing what's considered by the government to be fake news. This means that unless you're in total agreement with your government, as a doctor, as a patient, as a carer, you're in a predicament because you're going to face potentially, having to go along with this, stopping your business, stopping your activities on lockdown indeterminate amount of time until the government's happy. There's also going to be obviously some stuff we're seeing in China coming out is that they're looking into the WePay and the WeChat communications that citizens have had to identify them as people who might be affected by it. So not only do they have your location from your use of a mobile phone, but this is causing major problems. It's going to be a major citizen rights issue, and if it sweeps across the globe, as we're seeing this, I mean, we could all be living in China quicker than we thought we were. Is there anything you think on that line, and what sort of advice do you think we should take?
Well, you've got to say what you believe is the truth and what you've discovered to be the truth. Otherwise, why would you be in, for me, the journalism business? And if you were a doctor, why would you be trying to help patients? Otherwise, see, this whole idea of censorship is people can't tell the difference between truth and lies, so the government has to step in and decide, which is a false formula and equation, and amounts to censorship and what we would call in America the abrogation of the First Amendment, the right to free speech. So, for example, if I say, well, so-and-so epidemic turns out to be a dud, and the government disagrees with me, if we had the same law as, say, Taiwan is contemplating now, I could be thrown into jail and fined $100,000 just for saying that. Well, this is astonishing and astounding. And unfortunately, when you have free speech, you have to assume that the people that you disagree with also have a right to free speech. It's easy to say those who are on my side can say anything they want to, but those who disagree with me, or those who I consider to be crazy or kooks or conspiracy theorists or whatever, they have to be censored and even maybe locked up. That's pure insanity.
Yeah. So what do you think? We should be working, medics, telecom operators. I mean, the power at the moment really seems to be with the telecom operators. They can analyze the data, and whatever they conclude, the medics are going to have to go along with. I mean, we're seeing already things like the antibody tests to say that these viruses have been detected, and the accuracy with which for we're told is a new virus, the accuracy with which and the speed with which they've got this these tests out for this particular virus seem very very advanced. I mean, our own government here in Ireland hasn't been able to put out a reasonably produced video telling people what's happening, but in the same time, apparently they've got an accurate test. In the UK, for example, they say they've done 5,000 tests and they found nine patients or something like that. That's current information. And you're thinking, with a new test of that type, most people who understand about the testing procedures and how few people can do them and the skill set needed, most people would say, they'll be getting, 10 times that amount maybe in false positive, false negatives. So
this is a traditional problem with antibody tests. It's nothing new, really. And here's exactly what I'm talking about, a piece of information which some people would consider very controversial. I've been researching antibody tests since 1987 as a reporter. And I saw how in 1984, the so-called science was turned on its head. Previous to that, if a patient tested positive on an antibody test for a virus, for example, in most cases, this would be considered a good sign. In other words, the patient had contacted the virus, or its immune system had, and had successfully dealt with it. Or at the very least, you couldn't say anything about a prognosis, only that there had been contact with the immune system and the virus. But then all of a sudden, antibody tests were taken to mean positive tests that the patient was ill or was going to become ill. And there were reasons for turning this whole thing upside down, but they weren't good reasons, certainly not across the board, and they persisted to this day. So you're going to have huge numbers of people around the world testing positive, so-called, for the coronavirus, and the tests are completely worthless. And not only that, they're contraindicated. In other words, if anything is true, it's just the opposite of what the test purports to claim. Well, what is the doctor going to do if he knows this is true? Suppose he stands up on his hind legs and he says, wait a minute, I'm not going to do these tests because I know there are problems. In fact, in addition to what I've just said, there's the whole problem of cross reactions in which the test registers positive for factors that have nothing to do with a given virus. They just have to do with other behaviors. The patient had alcohol the night before, whatever. So what is that doctor now going to face? He has something to talk to his conscience about, seriously. These are not small matters, and they can't be brushed off. And I found time and time again in my research over the years where a mainstream researcher would say to me off the record, I can't get involved in this debate because if I do, my career is over, or I'm going to be blacklisted, or I'm never going to be able to publish again. So I'm going to have to take a pass on this one and live to fight another day. Well, I can only say to your audience that these were very serious issues I was talking about with these researchers. For example, is a given virus the cause actually of a given disease? When there's an enormous consensus that it is. And this researcher is basically telling me between the lines, no, it's never been proven, but I'm not going to stick my neck out.
Okay, so you've reported on before on previous dud epidemics. I believe we're never going to be. I believe we're at a point here where maybe 200 million people are on lockdown. The state is telling them where they're allowed to go. I think that's never happened in history before. I think that we also have a time where we've got the vast majority of the population, using social media, but also 99% plus using mobile. So across all age groups now, across all the world, we now have people who are mobile connected. We're also seeing voice coming in. I mean, a lot of the innovations that were going to be showcased at Mobile World Congress include the sort of move to voice. And we're seeing Alexas, we're seeing all these things in people's homes, live mics on mobile phones. Is it going to be impossible for doctors to even say off the record to people anymore? You know, you're talking as an investigative journalist. Do you think that these doctors are just going to dry up in coming out, and we're just going to
I
have
think a lot of them will, because they don't know who's listening. They don't know who's recording. They don't know what's going on. They have an idea, perhaps, but they can't guarantee it. So they stick, there's an orthodoxy of opinion on any subject. All right, so somebody's going to say to themselves, some sort of professional, I better be extremely careful about what I say and do, and stick as close to the orthodoxy as possible on every single issue, because who knows who might be recording me and put it out on the internet, or who might report me to government authorities, depending on which country I live in. This is an insupportable, insane kind of situation, because, again, what's happening here is that socially and culturally, a whole new kind of identity is being carved out to people or for people, which is extreme conformity, more than has ever existed before on a mass basis, when it comes to social, political issues of every kind. And so, I've dealt with this in my own career, in the sense of, I'll pitch a story to an editor at a publication. He'll say, we don't want to touch that. Well, why not? Well, it's just not the sort of thing that we would do. And I would say, you mean it's on the wrong side of the political spectrum? And he would say, well, yeah. And I say, well, suppose what I'm saying, though, is true. Does that matter? And he'd say, look, don't get me involved in this kind of discussion. I don't want to. I'm just telling you, we're not interested. And also, he implies, you probably shouldn't bother coming back to us with any pitches for new articles, because we see that you are not the kind of character we want to deal with. You should be smart enough to know which side of the political spectrum we're on before you even come up with an idea for an article. So this is the sort of thing that's been the case for me since 1982. But now, as you say, with social media, mobile devices, and so on, it's much, much worse.
And what do you think? Is there something you're seeing from past other epidemics that we could learn and we could go into this? Or is it just about the general stuff of privacy and...
No. There's plenty of specifics. Here's a story. Your audience will probably remember 2009, swine flu, another epidemic that was going to, overtake the world, and all sorts of ominous predictions were coming out of the World Health Organization and so on. So listen to this story very carefully, because it's astonishing, really, in its detail. Summer of 2009 in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, is announcing that there are thousands of cases of swine flu in the U.S. But star investigative reporter for CBS, Cheryl Atkinson, discovers that secretly the CDC has actually stopped counting cases of swine flu in the U.S. This is unheard of, because the mandate of the CDC is to count and report every week. That's what they do. So she says to herself, well, why did they stop counting? She investigates and she finds out. I interviewed her. I have the interviews on my website, No More Fake News. But CBS also published material on this. The reason the CDC stopped counting swine flu cases in the summer of 2009 was that the overwhelming percentage of tests from tissue samples of patients coming back from labs showed no sign of swine flu or any other kind of flu. Meanwhile, the CDC is telling people in the United States there are thousands of cases of swine flu. It's very dangerous, and you have to take the experimental vaccine. You should take it. All right. So she writes the story. She runs it by her boss at CBS and other people there, editors, legal experts, and so on. Everybody gives a green light. CBS publishes the story on their website, print article. Her boss is telling her, this is the most original story I've seen about the epidemic. It's fantastic, blah, 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 blah. So the next step for CBS would be to put it on their evening television broadcast, which is, much more powerful and reaches many more people. So Cheryl is moving in that direction, and all of a sudden the whole thing is shut down. Boom. No CBS affiliate television station in the United States will handle the story whatsoever. Not only that, but CBS is not going to cover this angle, so to speak, on the story anymore. It's dead in the water, gone, as if it never existed. Plus, no other major mainstream outlet in the United States, or to my knowledge in the world, picks up on Cheryl's story, a blockbuster that was published on the CBS News website. But 3 weeks later, roughly after they published their story, I found at webmd.com a story which I've cited at No More Fake News, that the CDC estimated that in the summer of 2009, at the height of the, quote, swine flu epidemic, get this, there were 22 million cases of swine flu in the United States. All right, so this is the kind of thing that I've been dealing with in these, what I call dud epidemics: SARS, West Nile, Zika, Ebola, etc., etc. There are commonalities in each case, serious commonalities, which defy and rebuke the official statement and characterization of the so-called epidemics. And I've written about this extensively and talked about it. Mainstream outlets have not picked up on any of this and don't want to and will not. That's before this new level of censorship that we're now talking about with, say, Taiwan, or the explosion of mobile devices and recording people and putting out, recordings on the internet and so forth. So that's kind of the background here that we're dealing with.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk to you about corporate crime and where you think that's orientated. It was a few years ago. So I've been attending Mobile World Congress since before it was Mobile World Congress, and I helped them organise what came off it, a mobile healthcare industry event, where we just took mobile people. But 3 years ago, they decided they wouldn't run anymore a mobile health component on the conference track. And it was on the last year that I received an email telling me I could bring an armed bodyguard with me to the conference.
Really?
So I thought quite a weird email, but it was because they were bringing such important people from heads of state and things like this. But I was thinking, we've gone from using this as a tool to promote positive healthcare, and now we're in a thing where people have to go to learn about stuff like that. They might be bringing an armed bodyguard to the room. So it was quite weird that it was scrapped from it. So where's your idea on where this corporate crime is? Who benefits from this stuff? Why are they trying to do this, and what's the ultimate objective, and what can people do to push back against this with their elected representatives?
Okay, well, there's many elements to the idea of corporate crimes. I'll give you a basic couple of examples. SARS, another dud epidemic, 2003. The final tally on this is official, was 800 deaths roughly in the whole world of 7 billion people. And yet again, everybody was warned at the outset, this is a big one, it's coming, it's going to cause tremendous chaos, illness, damage, and so forth. World Health Organization put out an advisory against flying into Toronto, which resulted in the city merchants losing $2-3 billion. I was in touch with an activist who was trying to put up a lawsuit against the World Health Organization in the aftermath. Excuse me, and it fell apart. Anyway, two things happened there. One is Frank Plummer, who was a microbiologist for the World Health Organization in Winnipeg, started telling reporters that fewer and fewer SARS patients actually had the coronavirus, which was the reputed cause of the disease, and that actually this number was approaching zero, which is just an incredible admission. In other words, the reputed new cause of this emerging pandemic was not being seen in the patients who were diagnosed with this new disease, which means that the whole thing completely fell apart if you just simply listened to what he had to say. But nobody did, including the press. They printed one story about it as if it was kind of a curio that you might find if you walked into an antique shop. Where did this lamp come from? And then they were completely silent after that. Okay, so put that together with this. Where did SARS reputedly start? Guangdong in China. So you go into the areas where it was said to have originated in 2003, and what do you find? You find that this was an area maybe number one in the world for recycling electronic waste. The shipment of computers and high-tech components and so forth that needed to be recycled. Huge tonnage was sent to this area, and workers at $1.50 an hour were working in factories to take apart computers and motherboards and so on and so forth in acid baths, breathing incredibly toxic fumes, SARS, acute respiratory symptoms. They were breathing several different kinds of toxic fumes. Some of this electronic waste and huge tonnage of garbage was actually just sent out the door of these factories, got into the rivers, which were heavily, heavily polluted. Drinking water actually had to be brought into this area because people couldn't drink the water out of the tap. It was a horrendous environmental situation and a corporate situation because there were companies who were employing all these workers to risk their lives to take apart these electronic components, huge quantities of them, breathe in the toxic fumes, acid baths, etc., lead poisoning, on and on and on and on. Well, this had to be hidden from the public. It had to be covered up. The illness that resulted from this had to be explained away in some other fashion that would be acceptable to the world community, to the world health community, to the world medical community, and thus we had a story about a new coronavirus and a new syndrome called SARS coming from this place. And then, as I just said, we flash forward to Canada and we find one of the leading microbiologists of the World Health Organization moving off the reservation suddenly and talking to the press and saying, hey, we can't even find the coronavirus in these SARS patients at all. Okay, well, that's an incredible story. There's corporate crimes being covered up by the cover story of a virus. I mean, this is a classic covert op that you would expect an intelligence agency to launch. Cover story, the real truth hidden. The cover story gains credence and widespread publication, and nobody goes back to the beginning of where it all started to investigate. Maybe something else was responsible for all of this. Well, I could go on and on. Just a quick footnote on here, which I could talk about for 6 hours. You look at certain parts of Africa, And what you're looking at is people starving, people hungry, people dying of that, and people dying of chronic dehydration and chronic diarrhea, people dying of contaminated water supplies, sewage pumped directly into the drinking water, farmlands, good fertile growing land stolen from the people by giant agri-corporations over a very long period of time, extreme poverty, etc., etc. It's industrial corporations taking over areas and polluting the soil and the water with extremely toxic compounds, etc., etc., etc. Expired medical drugs, unrefrigerated, being shipped into these areas to treat people, etc., etc., etc. Okay, these corporate crimes and government crimes also need to be covered up massively. Well, how are they covered up? Suddenly, all we hear about from this area are stories about the virus, which is destroying everybody on the continent if you accept it at face value. The virus is doing this, the virus is doing that. We've never seen anything like this before. It's all the virus, the virus, the virus. No, it isn't. And I learned this early on when a very reputed health worker out of Haiti, whom I was talking to about the virus, put me firmly in my place. This was 1987. She said, John, she said, frankly, you have no clue what's going on down here. Not a clue. I'm on the ground. I see the extreme poverty and destruction. I see the corporations taking over fertile farmland and stealing it from the people. I see 20 people living in a shack with no running water or electricity. I see the sewage being pumped directly into the drinking water. I see people being dying of dehydration and chronic diarrhea, and medical people refusing to give them simple packs that would at least supply some of the missing electrolytes. Instead, they're being treated with antibiotics, which is even causing more problems, et cetera, et cetera. She said, you really want to find out what's happening, you better investigate more thoroughly and stop just telling me, quote, it's a virus. So there are some of the corporate crimes that are being covered up here.
Yeah.
And as you say, if you want to go to, a conference where you're going to have heads of state sitting around listening to what I'm just saying, maybe you should bring a bodyguard. I don't know. I'd be happy to be at one of these conferences and say, let's all pretend we have a timeout here, boys, and let's just listen to some on-the-ground reports of what's really happening around the world, health-wise to people, and why, just in case you might be interested for a moment in the truth rather than cover stories, and then you can go home and do whatever it is you're going to do.
So to just wrap up on a bit more positive, patients are coming in, they're pretty much terrified by this. Doctors are reporting, how do we manage these patients with their concerns? They're talking things like mass extinctions, they're watching too much news principally. Perhaps they should just turn off from this sensationalization that's going on and look more at websites that have got different opinions and are more positive and can show them over the history of what's happened with these epidemics where, our societies are quite modern and they're able to quite easily cope with them,
I believe that's true. Why not? I mean, I've always thought that history matters. So if you look at previous cases of these so-called epidemics and you educate yourself about what actually happened, then you begin to think in a different way. You're not frozen and paralyzed by fear. You're not inclined to take the latest tidbit of fear-mongering and accept it as, God-sent truth. You begin to feel a little more calm and relaxed and think for yourself. And that's a good thing. I think that should happen more and more.
A psychiatrist I work with, he's come up with an idea, notepad, and just total digital detox where they don't use mobile phones, they don't watch TV, they don't use the internet, and just diary how they're feeling every day so that they can see, within a few days away from screens that are really animated and really well designed to engage you in what they're trying to tell you about, these people start feeling better. Do you ever advise anyone things like that, or see any results in that way?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I used to watch the news every night until I started screaming at the screen and could feel my, face flushing and my blood pressure rising and rising. And then I decided, well, if I want the kind of news they're going to offer me, I'd rather read about it, because then I can stop, I can pause, I can analyze, I can think. The thing with the screen is it just goes by. And as soon as you begin to even start to think about what is happening in front of your eyes, they're on to another story. We're talking about the news. And then if you can gather your wits again, we're on to another story. And so you don't have time. So it's all defensive and reactive. So yeah, taking a serious break, maybe a permanent break from television news, it's like breaking an addiction. You're going to feel better, but you're also probably going to feel worse too. And you've got to see your way through withdrawal symptoms and coming to a new sense of what you yourself think, what you yourself can discover. You have a life of your own that's independent from the news. What a revelation. And, take it from there.
One of the things I noticed he does is he relates to the patients how empathetic they are. And essentially, this is what is tripping them up. So the reason they're responding so harshly to seeing tragic things on a TV is because they're so wedded to it and they can't undo it. It's going into their eyes, being processed by their brain quicker than they can think. And so undoing it is kind of impossible. It's like it's happening right in front of them.
You reminded me of a story when I was a kid, and television first came into existence, television news. So, it was a fantastic thing every night. The family would sit down and watch the news. So one of these items would come on, and my mother would say, "Oh my God, that's terrible." And then 5 minutes later, my father would say, "Oh my God, that's horrible." And, a year, 2, 3 years, would continue to watch the news until finally one night I said, you keep saying how horrible this is. So why do you watch it? Right? And they sort of turned to me in anger because they were addicts and I was questioning their addiction. And they said, well, it's important. It's important. I said, yeah, but obviously you're quite disturbed at what's happening. I'm younger, so I have a more carefree attitude, but you're reacting as if, everybody is just falling by the way. It's important. We have to watch it. And they just continue to watch it and react in that way. Well, they needed to go through withdrawal symptoms.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before wrap up?
No, I think that's fine. People can read my material at nomorefakenews.com. I appreciate your time. And like I said, this is a 6 or 7 hour conversation that, could be continued indefinitely. But I think people get the idea here that thinking for oneself, investigating off the beaten track, going to the origin of these so-called epidemics and seeing what actually was going on is always a good thing. And it's, you have a right, and I would say as a duty, to investigate and research on your own and come to your own conclusions rather than accepting all official statements. So I thank you for your time.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All the best.